David Harris, a middle-aged man in his prime, sat behind the wheel of his sleek black Jaguar, feeling the weight of the day's stresses. As the CEO of a major financial firm, his life had been a whirlwind of deals, meetings, and expectations. His mansion on the outskirts of the city had been his sanctuary, an oasis of luxury that shielded him from the pressures of work. But today, as he made his way home on a quiet, empty road, something unexpected occurred that shattered his sense of control. A flat tire. Frustration crept in as David tried and failed to call for roadside assistance, his phone's signal cut off by the rural area he found himself in. The day that had already drained him of energy now seemed to mock him. Just as the silence and isolation were about to drive him mad, he spotted a figure walking toward him down the road. It was a young boy, maybe 14 or 15, wearing faded athletic gear and scuffed sneakers. His appearance suggested he wasn't someone David would expect to help. Yet there was something about the boy's determined walk and confident expression that caught David's attention. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady, almost mature. David eyed the boy, momentarily unsure of what to make of him. He had seen countless employees, assistants, and business partners, people who all worked with an agenda. There was always an exchange, always a favor expected in return. But here was this boy, seemingly from nowhere, offering help without hesitation. There was no judgment, no sign of reluctance. The boy simply offered to help without any hint of expectation. "Yeah, I do," David said, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "I was hoping for some help, but I'm out of range on my phone." The boy gave a small, reassuring smile. "I can help with that," he said, dropping to his knees next to the tire without another word. He worked quickly, confidently, as though he had done this many times before. David watched in silence, a strange mix of admiration and confusion swirling inside him. For the first time in years, David found himself standing there, unsure of what to do. The boy was not looking for anything in return. He wasn't trying to leverage his actions for any personal gain. There was a purity in his help that David had never truly encountered before. The whole encounter was strangely humbling. David realized that in a world obsessed with success, power, and wealth, this simple act of kindness had more value than all the riches he had accumulated. As the boy finished changing the tire and stood up, he wiped his hands on his jeans and flashed a small smile. "All done." David, still processing the encounter, offered the boy a few bills as thanks, his instinct to repay help strong. "Thank you for helping," he said, holding the money out. But the boy shook his head and took a step back. "No thanks, sir. I'm just happy to help." David stood stunned, the money still in his hand, as the boy turned and walked away down the road. The simplicity and sincerity of the exchange left David speechless. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by transactions and expectations, this moment was a reminder of something he had long forgotten: the power of selfless kindness. As the boy's figure disappeared into the distance, David's thoughts remained fixed on him and the world he seemed to come from. David couldn't shake the image of the young boy walking away, disappearing into the distance. His figure, dressed in faded clothes, seemed almost out of place in contrast to the polished world David inhabited. As he sat back in his car, the engine running but his mind elsewhere, David found himself wrestling with a sense of emptiness he hadn't realized was there until now. He had everything: a mansion, wealth, power, but the moment with the boy had revealed something he didn't know he was missing: genuine human connection. What struck him most wasn't just the boy's willingness to help, but the complete absence of any expectation in return. David had spent his life in a world of deals, where every gesture came with a price, a string attached. But here, in the middle of nowhere, with a stranger who clearly had little, David had encountered something that felt pure. The boy had helped him simply because he could, without wanting anything in exchange. Curiosity gnawed at David. He had to understand more about this kid, Lucas. Who was he? What made him so different from everyone David knew? Was it simply innocence, or was there something deeper? A rare wisdom that David had long since lost touch with in his pursuit of wealth. The next morning, David found himself driving back to the area near the flat tire, his mind still on the boy. He had a vague memory of where he had first seen him, but he wasn't sure if that was enough. He had already started asking around, questioning locals about the boy who helped him, but no one seemed to know anything beyond the usual. He was just a kid who helped people, a small, insignificant detail to most people. But to David, it had become everything. Hours passed, and David's search led him to a small, quaint cafe at the edge of town. Behind the counter, an elderly woman noticed his questions and smiled knowingly. "Sounds like you're asking about Lucas," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "That boy's always helping folks. He lives over in Harlan with his mama." Harlan, the name stuck in David's mind. It wasn't far, a small, modest town nestled in the foothills. He didn't know exactly what he was hoping to find, but he felt a strange sense of urgency. Whatever had drawn him to this boy, to this family, was more than just gratitude. There was a lesson here, something David couldn't ignore. David started the car and drove off, his thoughts racing. He did not know what he would find in Harlan, but he was certain of one thing. This wasn't just about thanking Lucas anymore. It was about rediscovering something he had long lost, the meaning of simple, selfless kindness. As David made his way into Harlan, the drive felt different, almost surreal. The beauty of the rolling hills and the quiet, serene atmosphere were a stark contrast to the hectic, power-driven world he had been a part of for so many years. As he pulled into the small town, he realized that he was no longer just looking for the boy who had helped him. He was looking for something deeper, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or a reminder of a life that felt more real than the one he'd left behind. David had never been one to believe in fate or destiny, but as he made his way through the streets of Harlan, he couldn't help but think that something greater had led him here. Every turn he made, every house he passed, seemed to draw him closer to an answer he hadn't even known he was seeking. He wasn't just chasing after Lucas anymore. He was chasing after a version of himself that had been lost in the chase for wealth and status. As he approached a modest house at the edge of town, David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The home was far from grand. Its small, faded exterior and sagging porch contrasted sharply with the pristine mansion he had left behind. But something about it felt warm, inviting, and real. The simple joy of this home made his own house, with all its luxury and sterile perfection, feel cold and empty by comparison. He knocked on the door, and moments later, a woman in her early 40s answered. Her tired yet kind eyes met his with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice welcoming but cautious. "I believe I met your son yesterday," David began, unsure how to explain his sudden need to see them again. "Lucas, right? He helped me with a flat tire." At the mention of her son, her face softened, and a small smile crept across her lips. "That sounds like my Lucas," she said. "He's always helping folks." She stepped aside, inviting him in. "He's out back. Feel free to wait." As David followed her through the small house, he couldn't help but notice how different this place felt. Warmer, filled with love and laughter, even in its imperfections. It was a far cry from his own polished, sterile mansion, and yet it radiated something his wealth had never been able to provide: real human connection. The moment Lucas appeared in the backyard, David's heart shifted. The boy stood there, working diligently on the fence, his focus entirely on the task at hand. David couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and shame. How had he gotten so lost in the pursuit of everything that didn't matter? And how had this boy, this humble, hard-working boy, reminded him of the most important lessons of all? "Hey, mister," Lucas said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What brings you back here?" David couldn't help but smile. The boy's genuineness was disarming. He had come looking to thank him, but now he realized it was more than that. Lucas had offered him a gift that no amount of wealth could ever match, a simple reminder of the value of kindness and human connection. As the sun began to set behind the Appalachian Mountains, casting long shadows across the small town of Harlan, David sat in the humble living room, a sense of warmth slowly washing over him. The house, though modest, seemed to possess a magic his mansion could never offer. There were no grand marble floors or designer furniture here, but the genuine laughter, the simple conversations, and the unwavering kindness from Lucas and his family felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. David hadn't expected to feel this way, but as he sat in the worn armchair, his mind kept drifting back to the events that led him here. Lucas, with his worn sneakers and old clothes, had done something David had never experienced before. He had helped with no strings attached, no hidden agendas, no expectation for anything in return. It was the kind of selflessness David had forgotten existed, buried beneath years of deals and transactions that only served to enrich his own pockets. I didn't realize people still lived like this, David said quietly, more to himself than to anyone in particular. His voice was filled with a mixture of awe and regret. Lucas's mother, standing in the doorway with a dish towel in hand, overheard him and smiled gently. "We're not poor, Mr. Harris," she said, her tone light but with a firmness that caught David off guard. "We've got what we need, and we've got each other. That's more than some people can say." David hadn't expected such a response, especially not from someone who had so little in material wealth. But it made him pause, made him reconsider everything he had spent his life chasing. He'd spent so many years accumulating things, houses, mirrors, business deals. But what was the point if they didn't fill the emptiness within? What was the purpose of all that wealth if it didn't bring true happiness, peace, or connection? The idea lingered as they sat down for dinner. Lucas and his mother didn't have much, but what they did have was real, authentic love, connection, and a sense of purpose that David could only admire from afar. Over the course of the evening, Lucas spoke about his dreams, his desire to work in construction, to build a better life for himself and his family. And for the first time in a long time, David felt something shift within him. This wasn't just about him helping them anymore. It was about them teaching him, showing him a life of meaning that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with giving, loving, and sharing. David had arrived in Harlan seeking to give back to Lucas, but it was clear now. He was the one who had received the most valuable lesson of all, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. Tomorrow, David knew, he'd make a change, not just in Lucas's life, but in his own as well. The next morning, David awoke with a sense of clarity that had eluded him for years. The events of the previous day, the generosity of Lucas, his family's quiet strength, and the deep conversations they'd shared, had shaken him to his core. As he sat in the comfort of his luxurious home, surrounded by everything that money could buy, he couldn't escape the nagging thought that all of this wealth and status meant nothing in comparison to the life Lucas had. What did it all matter if it couldn't buy the peace and satisfaction he now realized he desperately craved? David sat at his desk, staring out of the large windows that overlooked his estate. The view, once a source of pride, now felt hollow. His mind was racing. He knew what he needed to do next. It wasn't about more transactions, more profits, or more deals. It was about real impact. The kind of change that didn't just alter the lives of the wealthy, but uplifted those who truly needed it. He thought about Lucas and his family, about the home they lived in and the hard work that kept it together, the way they persevered despite their lack of resources. That was strength. That was real wealth. The decision came easily, almost instinctively. David needed to return to Harlan, not just to thank Lucas for his help, but to make things right. He'd spent a lifetime focused on material success. But in that small town, he'd found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and connection. He knew what he had to do. The family deserved more than a quick thank you or a handout. They deserved stability. They deserved opportunity. David gathered his things and prepared for the journey. He made a few calls, set things in motion, and by the time he reached the outskirts of Harlan, he had already begun to orchestrate a plan that would change everything. He didn't want to give them charity. No, this was about giving them the means to live a better life, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. A community that had shown him that true wealth wasn't in the things you accumulated, but in the lives you touched. When David arrived at the small house that had once seemed so humble, it now felt like a beacon of possibility. He wasn't there just to visit. He was there to make a difference. And he was determined that this family and this community would never be the same. He knocked on the door, and when it opened, he was ready. Ready to change not just their world, but his own. As the renovations on Lucas's home began, David watched from the sidelines, a feeling of satisfaction growing in his chest. The project was moving fast. Contractors, carpenters, and designers working tirelessly to give the house a much-needed facelift. Yet, despite the impressive changes taking place, it wasn't the fresh coat of paint or the new furniture that filled David with pride. It was the simple, quiet moments he shared with Lucas and his mother. Watching Lucas in particular brought a sense of clarity. The young boy, once reserved, now stood proudly beside the workers, his curiosity about construction growing with each day. The more David observed, the more he saw the boy's true potential. Lucas wasn't just someone who had helped him with a flat tire. He was a young man with dreams, ambition, and a natural aptitude for learning. David couldn't help but admire the way Lucas eagerly absorbed every bit of knowledge he could, asking questions, learning the tools of the trade, and watching the workers with sharp eyes. David, who had spent years negotiating corporate deals in cold boardrooms, realized he hadn't felt this kind of purpose in a long time. The hustle of business had consumed him, but here in the middle of this small town, surrounded by people who worked with their hands and their hearts, he was learning the true value of life. It wasn't about accumulating wealth. It wasn't about building empires of stock portfolios. It was about finding joy in giving, about helping others reach their potential and seeing them thrive. As days passed, David found himself returning to Harlan more frequently. He became a familiar face in the town, checking in on the progress of the renovations, speaking with the contractors, and even stopping by Lucas's school to see how the boy was doing. Lucas's mother, though grateful, continued to insist they didn't need any help. But David knew that what they needed wasn't just a new house, it was a future, and it was up to him to ensure they had the means to make that future possible. One afternoon, as David stood with Lucas, watching the workers set the final pieces of the new swing set into place, he realized something profound. He had spent so much of his life striving for more, for bigger achievements, for grander things. But here, in this small yard, with a simple swing set being installed, he felt more accomplished than he ever had before. This was real success. This was what life was really about. For the first time in years, David felt content, knowing that he was helping to shape not only the future of Lucas and his family, but also his own future. And as he stood beside Lucas, watching the boy's eyes light up with excitement, David knew that this journey was just beginning. As the final touches were placed on the renovations, David found himself standing at the edge of Lucas's front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The house, once tired and worn, now stood proudly, a symbol of hope and resilience for a family that had struggled but never given up. The transformation was more than just physical. It was a reflection of the changes that had taken place within David himself. Lucas and his mother had never asked for anything. Their humility and gratitude were lessons David had struggled to understand for years. His own life had been filled with luxury, excess, and a constant pursuit of status and wealth. But here, surrounded by modest homes and hardworking people, he realized that true richness wasn't in the things you accumulated, but in the connections you made, in the good you shared with others. As he watched Lucas run around the yard, laughing with his friends, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't about fixing up a house. It was about fixing a mindset. He had spent so much of his life focused on numbers, deals, and acquisitions. But standing here now, seeing the joy in Lucas's eyes, he understood that there was more to life than building empires. There was building relationships, giving back, and being part of something that truly mattered. The lessons learned through this experience weren't just personal to David, they were universal. In a world that often equates success with wealth, power, and status, it was easy to forget the simple truths that make life meaningful. The kindness of a young boy, the humility of a family with nothing to give but their hearts, and the willingness to make a difference. Those were the things that truly shaped a life well lived. David realized now that the true measure of success wasn't in how much you earned or how many people you could outpace in business. It was in how much you gave, how much you helped others, and how you made them feel valued and seen. Lucas had shown him that. As David prepared to leave, Lucas's mother joined him on the porch, handing him a cold glass of iced tea. "You've given us more than a house," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "You've given us hope." And with those words, David knew that the impact he had made at here was more than just changing a house. It was changing the course of their lives. In the end, this experience wasn't just about helping a family. It was about David rediscovering what truly matters in life. And it was a lesson he knew he would carry with him forever.